I'm Hannah Wolf. I've been tattooing for 18 years. I work out of California. My shop is in Oakland. It's called Old Crow Tattoo, formerly owned by Philip Millick. I authored, along with a couple of PhD scientists and medical doctors, The Science of Tattooing, which is a book you can buy on Amazon. And if you're in the United States, you can buy directly from my company. So today I'm going to be talking about pigments and the EU ink ban. And hopefully you guys have lots of questions. And yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Anna. Yeah, just like you mentioned that book, and I got it when because we have an interview on the podcast with Anna where she gets into a bit more detail into some of those things. And I would definitely recommend you, if you work with tattooing, to get the book, because it has a lot of, I find, information that you don't normally find, because it's not prioritized sometimes. So it's a lot of good knowledge for you to actually apply directly in your line of work, especially when we will get into it now that in Europe you have new legislation. Yeah, you know a lot about this stuff. So if you would like to, give a little bit introduction to, pigments and stuff.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do like a pretty quick overview of a couple of chapters of my book. All right. So let's see. Zoom can kind of be a pain in the ass here. All right, I'm just gonna go. All right, so let's see, what unit is this? In my book, which is also an ebook, so this is basically just the ebook, which you can download from eBay. I want to say it's unit 2 or 3. So the book kind of covers kind of like an introduction to chemistry, because I think that's pretty important to understand, like what the table of elements are and kind of how they react to the different types of elements that there are, metals, all of that kind of stuff. And then basically how neutrons bond to each other, and how these different chemicals kind of bond to create elements. So this, I'm just going to kind of go through this really quick. Salts, acids, and bases. This is important because a lot of metal salts are used for pigment manufacturing. Even with polymers, they'll have a basis that is a metal salt. So there are heavy metals in quite a few different pigments, even if they're stable polymers. So essentially, I don't want to go too much into this because we don't have a ton of time. So I'd say if you're really curious about it, just read the book. But basically, when there's an oxidization of a metal, you'll get a metal salt, which oftentimes can be something like this right here. And then there's kind of a not super high resolution, unfortunately, table here. But it kind of just goes over like how iron oxide can actually make a great number of different chemical pigments. So there's quite a few, and I think this is really important because there's quite a few different ways to manufacture the same color of pigment. However, whether it's stable or not kind of depends on the chemical compound. And I'll kind of get into like what stable means. So chemistry of tattoo pigments and dyes. So metal pigments are basically metal salts. That's right here. So metal oxides of heavy metals. So that would be things like titanium, cobalt, aluminum, iron, that type of stuff. So again, that's all in the periodic table of elements. Basically, if any of you are familiar with chemistry, some of us, went over that a little bit when we were teenagers. There's a portion of the periodic table which is all heavy metals, and a lot of pigments can be derived from heavy metals. So we'll also go over dyes, because dyes can be made with a great number of different things rather than just metal salts. So organic pigments are basically just pigments that are derived with a carbon molecule. So the word organic tends to be used in things like non-GMO foods, so something that's not genetically engineered, that has certain standardization in like growing practices, but that is not what organic means here. In chemistry, organic means carbon-based molecules. So that's kind of what this says right here, which means organically produced, so produced from a carbon. So basically, like everything in the natural world is carbon based. So that would be like human life forms, any kind of animal, trees, plants, all of that kind of stuff. Like we're all carbon based life forms. And when you get into chemistry that is not carbon based, it goes into like inorganic chemistry. So very much metal pigments can be also organic pigments. So dyes versus pigments. So the easiest thing to see here is this figure here. So a dye is soluble in a solution and a pigment is not. So a pigment is stable. So something that is dye, we all think of like food coloring. So that's a food-based colorant that is a dye. So what it does is it basically can bond to another compound. So if you add it to like cake, you know, to some degree it bonds to whatever the composition of the cake is. However, if you put the dye in a solution, let's say it's water soluble, then it'll break down the dye and process it. So the actual molecule is soluble in an aqueous solution. But that's, you know, water is not the only solution that can break down a dye. Some dyes are soluble in an alcohol. Some dyes are soluble in other kind of liquid chemical solutions. The most important one to think of, though, is going to be an aqueous-based dye because the human body is mostly water. So you don't want to put something in the human body that could potentially be toxic, which is broken down into an aqueous solution, because that means that whatever that carcinogenic, so whatever that toxic chemical that's bonded to the dye, once it breaks down, it's basically a free radical in the body, which means that it can attach and attack our body in a certain way. It's important to keep in mind as I move along, and I know this is going to be a lot of information, so I hope you guys have a lot of questions at the end, and I'm really glad that this is being recorded, because it's important to keep in mind that most pigments and dyes do have some kind of toxic component that is associated with them. However, it is in such a degree that is relatively non-toxic to the human body. And it is also important to keep in mind that in most countries, there's a little bit of regulation on tattoo pigments, but they are predominantly regulated like the cosmetic industry. And I'm just going to gloss over this because it pertains to later stuff when we start talking about the EU ink ban, is that the cosmetic regulation of tattoo pigments is based on basically topical application. And there isn't a lot of research into long-term effects of subdermal application of these chemicals. So I'll kind of move into how the inks sit in our bodies and how that processes through our systems. So again, this is a lot of information to put into such a small class here. So I do really suggest that you buy the book and read the book, because I do explain in the previous chapter basically how polymers are bonded by talking about the different carbon chains and basically like the different pigments based on whether they have like a benzene ring or not. So polymers, which is most pigments that we have, most stable pigments that we are using these days, are basically similar to plastics. So they're carbon chains. And again, this can have a heavy metal component to it. However, it's pretty darn stable in an aqueous solution, which means it doesn't break down in the human body. So they're relatively benign or safe to use in the human body, dependent. Sorry, my cat's yelling on Kitty. Okay. Get out of here. It's the joys of working from home. So again, you can read through this in the book. I'm not going to take too much time to explain all of this different stuff. But we are going to kind of move into why tattoos fade and UV and electromagnetic radiation. So tattoos fade because radiation from the sun can actually alter the chemical compound of the different pigments. So what is happening is the compound is getting knocked out of the visible spectrum for what we can see, and it is also breaking down these elements, so these molecules. So even though they're not soluble in a solution, they can be damaged by radiation. So this is the visible light spectrum. I talk about this a lot in the book, and there's a whole other portion of the book about the physiology of the human body and how our eyes and our brain perceive color. So basically, the type of radiation that we perceive is a very small amount of the radiation on like the radiation spectrum. So all of these different types of radiations that we can't see can affect different molecules. So what we see in these chemical compounds, basically a pigment, let's say blue. So blue essentially vibrates at a certain frequency that we see as blue. So it bounces the blue visible light spectrum back at our eye, and we pick that up as blue. However, all this other radiation, the blue chemical pigment absorbs, and some of that radiation can damage the pigment. And what happens there is it starts to break down. So it can either fade to the degree that the chemical compound changes to a visible light spectrum that absorbs everything in the visible light spectrum, and we no longer see that reflection back, or it absorbs the irradiation, and it damages the actual molecule and starts to break it down. So here's a histological section of the human skin, and basically like how the particles sit in the human skin. So what happens is that when the radiation breaks down the pigment, it starts to move through our lymphatic system. So that's this portion here of our metabolism, basically moving the pigment through the lymphatic system, because our skin is an organ, and our skin is constantly working to do all kinds of different stuff. So our skin is constantly creating different chemicals. It is moving toxins through the body. You know, if you put some kind of topical solution like a oxybenzone sunscreen or something like that, your body actually absorbs those chemicals. So you should also be mindful of like the types of topical, topical creams and stuff that you put on your body. But once something is injected into the skin, you know, you basically are right inside of the barrier of the human body. And if the pigment is stable, it's not going to affect the human body. However, as it breaks down, it starts to move further into our lymphatic system, which is our kidneys and our liver and our lymph nodes, which basically is the body's way of processing toxins throughout everything and moving it through the system until you eventually excrete it. So that's where the toxicity kind of comes into question as to when these pigments get broken down. How toxic are they really? Because if they're stable until they get irradiated, then that's fine. But it's like if you go in the sun a lot, if you live somewhere that's like a beach area, or you're someone who just really likes the sunshine, then you're basically breaking down the pigment, which can be toxic eventually to your system, depending on your own physiology, because obviously every body is different. So that's kind of like the quick overview of all this kind of stuff. And then we'll kind of go back to like the types of pigments. So there are there are aromatic pigments. And so the different types of pigments in these polymer carbon chains basically just depend on the chemical compound. And that kind of goes into depth within the book. Again, I don't have a ton of time for it. So you have aromatic pigments, you have polycyclic aromatic pigments, which basically is a compound aromatic pigment. And then you have azo pigments. So an aromatic pigment has a benzene ring, and azo pigment does not. Although there can be chemical compounds that are basically mashups of all of these different things. So the book kind of just talks about like how the skin works and where it moves through the system. Okay, so here's kind of some cross sections of lymph nodes that have had some kind of biopsy as to like where the ink is. And your lymph nodes are part of the lymphatic system. You've got some in your armpits and your neck. And that is, I don't know, somewhere in here kind of goes over the lymph nodes. But they're all over your body. And it's basically like the entryway to your lymphatic system. So things move through your lymph nodes and then they go to your liver and kidneys before they are excreted from your system. So the ink gets stuck in each one of these processes. And that's kind of the question there as to like what the toxicity is and how it kind of affects the body long term. Because if you're a heavily tattooed person, like a lot of us are as tattoo artists, obviously we don't want to like be detrimental to our own long-term health by getting tattoos. And I think that from a regulatory perspective is also the big question, is that, you know, are these pigments going to have long-term effects on people that were unintended, you know, both for consumers like us getting tattoos, as well as operators, us giving tattoos, because we also don't want our clients to be unhealthy. So that's kind of this portion here, just talking about like pigments and how they're carcinogenic and the potentiality of it. Again, there's not a ton of research into this for long-term effects because dermatologists and educational institutions haven't really been getting involved in this, as well as regulatory agencies and government agencies, which is where a lot of the money comes from to do this type of research. It's kind of like a newer thing. So like 2010s is really when people started to consider it and think about it. So it's really just been in the last 5 to 10 years that there's been a lot of research and investigation and consequently legislation associated with all of these types of pigments. So other materials in tattoo pigments. So obviously you have your raw powder. And that can be any number of different stuff. So raw powder manufacturers are basically chemical companies, mostly out of China and some other countries, that basically manufacture just a powder form chemical component. So from here, an ink manufacturer will take that chemical component because they don't manufacture the powder pigment themselves. They buy it from a wholesaler. And then it comes to their manufacturing facility, and then they use their formula to basically make a tattoo pigment. So there are specific requirements on essentially dosage of what certain pigments can be used per suspensory solution, which is going to be the solution that suspends the ink, within the bottle, which is basically the aqueous solution. However, it's not always water-based. It just kind of depends on how the manufacturer is manufacturing the pigment. And unfortunately, that is kind of like the trade secret. So that's proprietary information. So a ink manufacturer can disclose what they're using, but they don't disclose to what level. So they don't actually tell you their recipe. They'll just tell you what is in their pigment. So just like reading the back of a can of soda or a box of cereal, you can see what the ingredients are, but you can't see to what the recipe actually is. And I think to some degree that can be a little concerning because again, there isn't a lot of regulation on tattoo pigments, a little bit more in Europe, but basically none in the United States. So the United States may kind of catch up with where Europe is in a number of years, but everything is so bureaucratic here, it may or may not happen. So unfortunately, you can also run into other problems based on the suspensory solution. So basically, this kind of just goes over like what can be in a suspensory solution. And usually the suspensory solution also has some kind of agent of sterilization. So that's antiseptic agents. So that would be something like alcohol. Typically, pigments are also irradiated with cobalt irradiation. Let's see. Well, that's in a different chapter. It's not right here. So cobalt irradiation can kill live microbials and fungi. So sometimes when the raw pigment is manufactured, it also can have live cultures in it. So it also can have some form of microbacteria or some kind of fungi. So when it's manufactured, it also has that within the bottle. And that's also a problem in the manufacturing process, because as tattooers, we want it to be sterile so that our clients don't have allergic reactions. And the easiest way to go about that is to abide by your expiration date on the bottle. It seems like it's, you know, kind of an arbitrary thing that gets us to buy more, but it's actually really important, because cobalt irradiation does not kill spores. And what happens over time is the spores mature and they turn into something that could be a culture within the bottle that can be detrimental to the healing process of the tattoo. So if your tattoo ink expires, throw it away, buy another one. Just try to be safe as possible about it. You abide by all these other sterilization processes while tattooing. So like, why not also do that with your ink? So I think as we progress into kind of like a more educated industry, we can also abide by better business practices just as an industry to self-regulate, to basically bring tattooing like up into the 21st and 22nd century, so that regulators don't step in and have bad things to say about tattooing. Okay, so real quick, I'm going to move into the EU ink ban. Okay, so two pigments that the EU is trying to ban right now is blue 15 and green 7. So I can post all of these different links for everybody, but basically the European Chemical Agency, they've posted quite a bit of information about this. However, it's like, there's not a lot of public information about this. So I had the compliance director for World Famous Ink, which is an international ink manufacturer, kind of like have an hour-long conversation with me just about like what's going on, how everything's happening. So the ink ban is a proposed ink ban. It's not an actual ink ban. So these two colors are not illegal yet. So what is happening is they have 2 years starting last year to basically prove that these two pigments are not detrimental to a person's health. So what the European, oh, I'm on the wrong share here. New share. Okay. So what the European Chemical Agency is proposing is that these two chemicals, green 7, blue 15, are no longer usable for a cosmetic procedure which would be like eyeshadow or lipstick or something like that, because they're known skin irritants and eye irritants. So the problem with that is that typically tattooing is not used around the eyes or mouth unless it's going to be some kind of cosmetic procedure. And how often are they really using blues and greens for eyes and lips? So personally, I would say, why are we trying to get rid of this altogether when there's no concrete evidence that it is going to be a long-term detrimental effect on the human body used in intradermal tattooing, when you could just ban it for cosmetics? So here's material safety data sheets. So here's the thing about all of these raw pigments. And let me just see here. So this is what the pigment looks like when it's just the chemical compound. So it's basically just a powder form of pigment. And each of these different types of pigments can be used in a million different ways. So some of these pigments are used for hair color. Some of these pigments are used for auto paint. Some of these pigments are used in acrylic painting and oil painting. Like, it's just raw pigment. So some of this stuff is super toxic, and that's why you have to wear, gloves when you oil paint, because you don't want it directly on your skin. But that level of toxicity in pigment and pigment load is not allowed for intradermal tattooing. So yeah, this is what the raw powder pigment looks like. So both green 7 and blue 15 are phthalocyanide components. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly. I'm not a chemist, but I believe it's phthalocyanide. So when you look up phthalocyanide on Wikipedia, you get this right here. Toxicity and hazards. No evidence has been reported for acute toxicity or carcinogenity of phthalocyanide compounds. So this is kind of why it's frustrating for the tattoo industry, because regulators are stepping in to try to ban something, and they're kind of getting ahead of themselves. So from the manufacturing standpoint, a lot of manufacturers are very frustrated right now because dark blue and dark green, which are what these two chemicals are, they're used in a lot of different pigments. So most pigments are most stable when they're manufactured as that pigment. However, most pigments are only manufactured from a chemical agency as a primary and a secondary color. So that would be red, blue, yellow, and then secondary would be like orange, green, et cetera, et cetera. And then real quick, because I know I'm running out of time. So this is
no worries, Anna. Keep going.
Okay. Basically, these are all of the different chemical compounds that are used for tattoo pigments. And again, I can send these all to Steph so they can be posted. So if you guys are really curious about it, you can look through it. But again, this is basically just like a pile of powdered pigment. And these are the different chemical compounds. So there are all these different pigments. So this is blue 15 right here. And then here's the hazard classification over here for all of these different pigments. So you can see that there's a bunch of different reds that can be used, which unfortunately is why some reds are super reactive. And I'm sure we've all had a client who's had some kind of reaction to a red. Some reds are more reactive than other reds. Some reds are more stable than other reds. So all of this is basically, manufacturing processes on a chemical perspective from each manufacturer. Is they all use specific colors based to their proprietary recipe for each type of the different inks, which is why some colors from some companies, even though they make the same color, are more stable, easier to work with, and less reactive, because there's 1,000 different ways to make, well, not necessarily 1,000, but there's a few dozen different ways to make a lot of the same colors. So these are all different types of pigments. Some of these pigments are food safe, you know, so they're typically not used in tattooing because if it's food safe, it's usually not the most stable and it's usually a dye. So it's usually something that's a little bit more solvent. And that's what you see here in these different pigments, like solvent violet, depending on what its solvent solution is, it may not be a stable pigment to use for tattooing, because if it's solvent in an aqueous solution, it'll disappear once it gets in the body. And that, my friends, is why when you put a stencil on the body and then tattoo over the stencil is not permanent because it's a dye. So as soon as the stencil gets into the body, your body just moves it through and it just kind of gets broken down and it disappears. And it is relatively non-toxic. And I think that's, I want to say it's Venetian purple, which is like a food safe dye. So yeah, so here are all these different greens and reds and all this different type of stuff. So each manufacturer that you go to, even small manufacturers, are required to give you a material safety data sheet on their pigment. So this is a material safety data sheet for just the chemical compound pigment. So on here, and you can request this again. So if you go to a company, let's say it's Intense, and you request like material safety data sheet for their bright red, basically it'll have a breakdown of what the type of colorant is used in the pigment, and then it'll also have a breakdown of like probably alcohol, glycerin, that kind of stuff. So if you're curious about which pigment is which, especially if you've had a client who's had a reaction to that specific pigment, request that from the manufacturer, and then you can just do a Google search on the colorant and you can figure out, okay, what colorant is this? You know, maybe I should avoid this. So for these different for these different pigments from the material safety data sheets directly from the company, again, here's the issue, is that there's no hazard classification. Like there's identification that it can be an irritant when in direct contact with the skin or the eye. However, the pigment load and the contact load is not on the surface of the skin, inhaled, or in the eyes. So it's kind of like, is it really going to be detrimental or not? Because the only way to test it is to basically test the pigment on a living creature that has a lymphatic system. And there just isn't that type of research as of yet. You can do organ chip testing, which basically they have a synthetic cell for an organ and they can test long-term effects, or they can basically, what they do is they take this chip and they'll put some kind of chemical on it, and then it goes into a computer and they can do data projections and machine learning to figure out long-term projected effects of that chemical on that organ tissue. So there would be like a liver cell or a kidney cell or a skin cell. The problem is that there's a lot of different cells in the human body, and organ chip testing isn't necessarily going to be a full lymphatic system comparable kind of test. And then the only other way to test is basically through laboratory animals, which most ink companies do not want to do because it's, you know, it's not very kind to our animal friends. So, I mean, as time continues, we'll have better information on all of this type of stuff. This specific ban on these two green and blue pigments, it's not the end of green and blue pigments, because there's lots of different greens and blues. So if the European Chemical Agency decides that we're not going to allow these two pigments to be used in tattooing anymore, it's going to cost a lot of money for the pigment manufacturers to change a lot of different formulas. But ultimately, if it does mean that tattooing is safer, it's going to be a good change in the long end. I think something that we all have to be apprehensive of, unfortunately, as tattoo artists, is that we don't want regulatory agencies to run away with our rights in the tattoo industry based on speculation. And that's what it is that they're making regulation based on speculative information. And, you know, like we all need to come together as an industry to try to, you know, to support innovation, to support research, and to really try to keep tattooing safe. That means get involved as much as you can on local levels, pay attention to stuff, and try to educate yourself as much as possible, because all that we can do is volunteer our time to try to be industry relevant experts wherever we are in the world. So I want to open it up for questions now. Do I have time for that, Steph?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay, so if anybody has any questions, go for it.
Questions now?
Yeah, so I mean, is that basically everybody? I don't know
Stephanie.
the best way to do it.
Stephanie, yeah.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. So in relation to what you were talking about, like the stencil going on the skin and it being dye-based and being broken down and that being totally safe, on the same topic, like how do you feel about artists using different types of markers or Sharpies that aren't intended for the skin and tattooing on top of that? I've always wondered if there was any risk with that because those things aren't necessarily made to be used on the human body. Is it the same thing? Is it just as safe and it just gets broken down because it's a dye?
Yes and no. So again, there are specific dyes and pigments that can be skin irritants. So it's a dye, yes. But I know a lot of people have had a sensitivity with Sharpie red. So then you have a dermatitis reaction before you even start tattooing. So you'll have an inflammatory reaction where the skin gets like raised and puffy where you draw the marker. So is it dangerous to somebody's health? I don't know. It depends on the type of skin colorant. You know, again, when you look at all of these different types of chemicals, like some of them are not safe to use like as topical. So there are definitely safer pigments to use versus not use. I think it really does bode a little bit more research into like asking for a material safety data sheet from the marker company and then looking up the different type of pigment and seeing if it is like a severe skin irritant, you know. But then again, it's like you might be pretty safe and you might have that one person in 200 that has a reaction to it. From a chemical like carcinogenic, mutagenic, reprotoxic perspective, no, it's not going to like give somebody cancer or some kind of like detriment to their reproductive process or anything like that. Like it might just irritate the skin, which may make it harder to tattoo.
Okay, thanks.
Do you have another question, Stephanie, or that was it?
Well, I guess so. Like, I was just wondering also, like, I'm in Canada and you're in the States, like, it's, you know, like you were saying, tattoo pigments are not regulated at all. Like, are there brands on the market that are, till this day, still, like, using pigments that are deemed unsafe or carcinogenic? Or is that, you know, kind of, you know, few and far between or just rare these days?
Yes and no. So most first world countries are going to require that there is a certain, so this is basically a standard process for most countries in that the pigment load for toxicity has to be below a certain percentage. And that's kind of like what you see here is not more than 1% of hydroxy 3, oxo 3H, xanthine, benzoic acid, and 2% you know. So it's yes. I guess the answer is yes, because there's no regulatory agency following up to make sure that the pigment load with the chemical compound is what it says that it is. And that's the big problem that we're having across the world with new regulation and research that's been happening in Australia as well as Europe, is that these different ink manufacturers aren't really doing a chemical test. They're just kind of like assuming that whatever they get from the manufacturer is safe, and then they're putting it into their ink. And the manufacturer doesn't necessarily have, they don't have like a duty to actually manufacture things in a way that's congruent with any kind of like health agency, legislative agency requirements on safety for cosmetic pigment additives. So some companies are definitely a little bit safer in that regard, and it's kind of hit or miss. You know, usually the big companies that also manufacture in Europe are doing a pretty good job. But I just don't think that we're at the point in pigment manufacturing to like where we can guarantee that every pigment that you get is going to be what it says it is. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I think it just is going to push me to seek more information about the products that I'm buying, to be honest, and using on my clients.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any more questions? No?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. All right, go ahead.
So in the tattoo industry, is there already like an internal governing body? So like, for example, with the piercing industry, there's the Association of Professional Piercers. Is there anything set up like that where people are like beginning to research and like get together to try and to regulate from within, sort of thing? Or is it still something that's to come?
You know, there is the I want to say it's like the National Tattoo Association in the United States. Yeah, the simple answer is no. And I think that is a big problem in tattooing. There are quite a few of us who are volunteering our time and energy into basically participating in regulation. However, the unfortunate side of it is that most of these people are also associated in manufacturing. So their interest is going to be from like a capitalist perspective on how to make the best profit off of this rather than how to make the best safe decision off of it. So there are a couple people like me, and there are a couple people who are in the APP who do also participate in this kind of stuff, because I think for whatever reason, piercers are so much more interested in health and safety, chemical compounds, all of that kind of stuff, whereas tattooers seem to be more interested in applicable process, which would be like, what's the most stable and brightest yellow, and how to work it, and what needles do you use, and how do you make the best tattoo. Whereas when you really get down to like the component side of it, there really aren't that many of us who are super interested in it, which is why I did my project, The Science of Tattooing, because my hope is that I can kind of light that fire in people. And yeah, it would be great if we could have a centralized agency. The problem is time and money. And a lot of us just don't have the time and money for it. And I would love to volunteer more of my time for this, but you know, I already run a tattoo shop. I tattoo full time. I run The Science of Tattooing, and then it's like volunteering more of my time. It just kind of gets ridiculous. And I think that that's kind of what we run into in tattooing, is that a lot of us don't have a lot of downtime, because after you paint flash and you do your homework for your clients and you answer all of your emails, you might want to break. You don't want to like sit in on regulatory meetings.
I totally agree, but I think it's like super important. So it's nice.
I agree. Yeah, it's really necessary. And if someday somebody wanted to have a nonpartisan role in basically unifying people around the world, because we're all one industry, I think that would be great, and we could get behind it. Mario Barth tried to do something like that, kind of in a pretty insidious way in the United States a couple years ago. He started something called the Coalition of Tattoo Safety. And it was basically him and a bunch of ink CEOs and tattoo supply company CEOs that sat on this board for this nonprofit. But they were taking people's money and they were using it to lobby in Congress. to basically keep regulation at a standstill and not have any standardization in manufacturing, which is basically standing against progress, because we can basically champion good business practices and safer manufacturing business practices without also just saying, no, we don't want it. But yeah, I mean, I would love for more people to get involved. So if you're interested in taking the reins, or, you know, people that do, like, you know, let's do it. I know Aaron De La Dova did a class for you, Steph, and he started, what is it? It's an organization for tattooers in California. And that's what we basically did in the first few months when we were shut down. Yeah, the PACT. Yeah, the Professional Alliance of California Tattooers. And when we were first shut down and people had time, we did a lot of work. But as soon as everything reopened, everything just kind of got put to the wayside. So yeah, maybe if we can all have an organization like PACT and we can all pay a yearly fee to it, which will pay somebody who works full time, who's not a tattooer, who can manage everything, like that would be awesome. But it just takes organization.
Yeah, I think it goes down a lot to what you mentioned, which is time and money, and it goes down to organization in the sense that people have to, realistically, a lot of people like yourself don't have the time, because if you have a family in a shop, I mean, what's left, right? So then you have to find a way that you can afford somebody that only does that, like you mentioned. And sometimes the thing is, I've seen, because I spent 10 years on the road, so I worked in many different countries, so I've seen the many different realities, and without mentioning specific ones, but I've seen that sometimes those guilds that are created, they not always have that type of best interest at heart, and sometimes a little bit of a lobby of, you know, some older people that wants to keep the power in certain hands, you know, and you know, and so you pay that fee, but it's like, okay, what does the fee gives me? It's like, oh, if you do that, we do this. Like, no, you don't. It's like, you know, so yeah, I guess it's really about, you know, creating a guild or whatever that really is organized and really puts that money to effort to, you know, create jobs that make a difference, like you were saying, right?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Because that's what it takes. You need someone who full-time manages the whole thing and gets everything together, and who actually works for it. Because if you just have an organization of volunteers, nothing ever gets done.
Yeah, absolutely. And as anything, there has been any change in your thing since I saw you last time?
I mean, we're all just trying to live through COVID.
Yeah.
I think that's the big thing. I've been working with the Association of Food and Drug Officials, which is an ancillary and advisory agency to the FDA in the United States. And when I have time, I volunteer to sit in on calls for them. And what they're doing is they're trying to have a standardization of training for inspection for tattoo shops in the United States. So basically what they're going to do is work with the National Environmental Health Association, and they basically teach inspectors about the tattoo industry, so that when you have tattoo shop inspection, an inspector doesn't come in and touch your tube cleaning dirty sink with their bare hands and then touch everything else in the shop. Because I'm sure we've all seen really scary stuff like that, where it's like they're supposed to know all of the ins and outs of the inspection and regulation on this, and then we find that they don't know anything, and then we're teaching them as they come in. So I've volunteered a little bit with that organization to kind of help with them. And yeah, I mean, every once in a while I do something like this and just kind of try to like teach people and get the information out there. I mean, I would love to do it more. And I had hopes to do it more before COVID hit. I was going to travel and do a bunch of conventions, teach a bunch of different seminars at this and that. But it's kind of like we're all just at a standstill, and the industry is like just completely locked until COVID gets managed. And then we can kind of like go back to our carny gypsy lifestyle.
Yeah. I would say that if there is anybody that will watch this later on and they might want to, help or do something towards this, they can send me an email, and then, perhaps I may put them in touch with you if somebody is willing to offer their time for something, because sometimes you can do even some things remotely or something. So I'll definitely,
Totally. And I will also add that if somebody emails you and they have more information on some kind of guild or association in Europe of people that are doing this, because I know that there are people doing this in Europe, and I don't necessarily know them because I don't participate in Europe that often, that maybe we can compile information and make that accessible to people in Europe as well as like other countries.
Absolutely. There is now I can't remember off the top of my head. I need to look into it, but I think there are two, if I'm not wrong, German guys that are taking on the, let's say, the responsibility to do something about this pigment ban in Europe. So they started, I think, some sort of proposal. I can't remember now. I need to look, properly without saying anything incorrect. But I think there is somebody, and I think they were from Germany, that started something towards this. Some more of
Yes.
official, organized something.
Yeah, there's quite a few people in Europe right now that are working against this ink ban, especially ink manufacturers, because in a lot of regards, it's kind of ridiculous that they've just decided out of speculation that now we can't use these two pigments. So I am of the strong belief that things shouldn't be regulated unless it's like unequivocally a yes or a no. So speculation to me isn't enough of it's not enough of a reason to shut something down, and it's the same thing with all of us during COVID with our tattoo shops getting shut down. Rather than actually investigating whether or not tattooing can be safe during a pandemic, most regulatory agencies around the world have just said, no, you can't do it at all. So personally, I've always felt like tattooing is a little punk rock, and tattooing hasn't asked for permission as much as that. And I think that if we educate ourselves and we're safe as possible, at the end of the day, it should be our decision what we do with our bodies, and it should be our clients' decision what they do with their bodies.
Absolutely. Anna, thank you so much. So every time I talk to you, it's like a mountain of information. So I'm sure that perhaps people will be interested in having you back, because it's such a little time, to get into those things. But yeah, thank you so much for doing this, taking your time again. And again, where can people find you and your book?
So you can go to thescienceoftattooing.com, or you can go to tattoosbyhannah.com. But thescienceoftattooing.com has links to some more information and some links to buy the book. Or you can go to Amazon and just search for thescienceoftattooing.com. There's an ebook as well as a paperback that ships worldwide.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, guys. Is there time for a small question?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask Hannah, is there any problems or damage if we mix different pigments together, like from different companies or some stuff like that?
Well, that's kind of a loaded question. So the simple answer is yes and no. Basically, if the pigment is manufactured to the standardization of what pigment should be manufactured as, no, because you're mixing two elements that are both stable, that both have low enough toxicity that it's not going to be problematic. So because you're just mixing two stable pigments together, you're not actually like making a laboratory compound. So each element is stable, and you're basically putting two stable elements together. You're not combining the two. So it's not combining to make some kind of other chemical compound. The problem with mixing lots of different colors together is that because it's not a stable compound, that over time, certain parts and certain colors will fade faster than others. So let's just use purple as an example. So you use a blue and you use a red and you put them together, and now you have a purple, and it's not a chemically manufactured purple. So over time, usually the red will fade faster and you'll be left with kind of a foggy blue. So yeah, from a safety standpoint, no, not at all. You can mix whatever you want, as long as each of these pigment manufacturers are using better business practices. It's just it's more of like the longevity of the color. But again, most pigment manufacturers that are making a stable raw powder pigment only use primary and secondary colors. So finding something like turquoise, like from a stable powder pigment from a chemical manufacturer, is like near impossible.
All right, awesome. All right, Anna, thank you again. Have a lovely morning, I guess, over there.
All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks,
And
Anna.
have a good day, everybody.